The airport was alive with a symphony of sounds. The endless rolling of suitcases over tile muffled conversations, intercom announcements, and the faint hiss of ventilation. Yet amidst this noise, my mind was focused entirely on Malik. My 12-year-old son sat beside me, his small frame hunched over in his seat, clutching his backpack like it was a shield. His brown eyes darted around nervously, reflecting the fatigue and unease that had been his constant companions during travel. I had known this moment would come, the one where the world, in all its indifference, would suddenly focus its judgment on my child. Malik was different, yes, but that difference didn't make him less human. It didn't make him deserving of ridicule or dismissal. Yet, as we approached the gate, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that told me we were about to confront it anyway. "Mom," Malik whispered, his voice barely audible over the terminal chatter. I leaned in close, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "It's okay, Malik," I said softly, attempting a reassurance I didn't entirely feel. "We'll be fine, just a normal flight, that's all." His fingers twisted the straps of his backpack, and the small bottle of medication rattled with each movement. That bottle was his lifeline, a carefully measured dose that kept him stable and able to breathe through the anxiety that often overwhelmed him. We reached the boarding gate, and a flight attendant with a crisp uniform and a sharp expression met us. Her eyes lingered on Malik's small frame on the medication bottle, and immediately I sensed that familiar prickling in my neck, a warning that someone was about to dismiss, belittle, or humiliate us. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but icy. "What is that you're carrying?" I straightened, gripping Malik's hand a little tighter. "It's his medication," I said, keeping my voice calm. "He needs it before takeoff." The attendant's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a tight line. "You can't bring that on the plane," she said firmly. "It has to stay behind." Time seemed to slow. Malik's eyes widened in panic, and I felt a surge of anger and helplessness crash over me simultaneously. "This is his medicine," I said, trying to maintain control, my voice firm but steady. "He needs it now. Please, you can't take it." She shook her head dismissively. "Rules are rules, no exceptions." Malik's small shoulders trembled as he tried to hold back tears. Passengers around us began to notice, some staring with curiosity, others with judgment or thinly veiled amusement. The humiliation was immediate, suffocating like a physical weight pressing down on us. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the cabin door behind us opened and my ex-husband stepped in. His presence was commanding, a calm authority that immediately drew the attention of those around him. His eyes scanned the situation before locking on the flight attendant. "She needs that medication now," he said firmly. His voice carried across the terminal, leaving no room for argument. "You're not taking it from her." The flight attendant froze, her hand loosening slightly on the bottle. Doubt flickered across her face, replacing the certainty she had carried moments before. Around us, the murmurs of other passengers grew louder, curiosity and tension blending in the air. Malik's eyes sparkled with hope. "Dad," he whispered, relief and fear mingling in his voice. I felt the tension in him ease slightly as my ex-husband returned the medication to my hands, his gaze meeting mine in a silent acknowledgement of the fear, the near humiliation, and the small victory. But the dismissal in the flight attendant's eyes, the judgment in her posture, lingered. It was a reminder of how quickly society assumes certain people are inconveniences, how easily their needs can be minimized or ignored. I thought of every other parent, every child who had faced this alone without intervention. I realized the courage it took to stand firm, to speak up, to demand recognition of basic human dignity. And I knew that this moment, small as it seemed, was a declaration. Even in a confined, crowded airplane cabin, justice could be asserted. Malik leaned against me, finally relaxing, but I remained vigilant. The cabin shifted, passengers quietly absorbing the tension, the power dynamics altered not by rules but by action, by courage, by someone refusing to be ignored. I held him close, feeling the tremors in his small body reflecting on the future. There would be countless moments of prejudice, countless times when we'd have to summon courage just to be treated fairly. But today we had carved out a space for that courage to exist and for dignity to be recognized. The plane ascended, the engines humming steadily, carrying us above clouds and over the city. And as I looked at Malik, feeling his small hand in mine, I understood. This was just the beginning. Our story, our courage, our voice, it would not be silenced. The flight attendant stepped back, her hands hovering awkwardly as if unsure whether to assert authority or retreat. The murmurs around us had grown into whispers, passengers craning their necks, trying to catch snippets of what had just unfolded. Malik's small fingers tightened around my own, his pulse quickening with anxiety, yet there was a spark of relief that hadn't been there moments before. I could feel every eye in the vicinity on us, some judging, some curious, some quietly supportive. And I realized then just how raw this kind of scrutiny could feel, how every action, every word was amplified when people assumed you were less than, assumed your needs were inconveniences. My ex-husband's presence had shifted the energy, yes, but the undercurrent of judgment lingered, subtle yet sharp. I could feel it pressing against my skin, a reminder that the world often waited for a misstep, an excuse to label someone as wrong or incapable. Malik noticed too, his small brow furrowing, eyes darting to the other passengers. "They're looking," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I know," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But we're doing the right thing." The attendant's eyes flicked to him, then back to me, and for a fleeting moment I saw hesitation. Something human had cracked through the rigid professional mask. I just need to see the prescription," she stammered, holding out a hand as if to reclaim authority. I reached into Malik's backpack and pulled out the folded papers, the tiny prescription that had become a symbol of his survival. I handed it to her carefully, my fingers brushing against hers. She looked at the papers, then back at us, and I could see the shift, a battle between procedure and common sense playing out across her face. The tension was nearly tangible. Around us, passengers shifted, some whispering to one another, some watching silently, absorbing the scene like it was unfolding in slow motion. It was impossible not to notice the weight of every second, every gaze. "You're supposed to administer this," she asked finally, her voice quieter now, less commanding. "Yes," I said firmly, meeting her eyes. "He needs it now, he cannot wait." Her jaw tightened and she hesitated, glancing around at the other crew members as if seeking validation or permission. But no one intervened, it was just us and the choice to act humanely or to perpetuate the humiliation that had started the moment she noticed Malik. Finally, she nodded curtly. "Administer it here quickly," she said, stepping aside. I handed the bottle to Malik, watching his small hands shake slightly as he prepared his dose. The relief on his face was immediate, a release so profound it almost brought tears to my eyes. This wasn't just medicine, it was recognition, acknowledgement that his needs mattered, that he wasn't invisible, that he wasn't a nuisance. As he swallowed, I kept my gaze calm but sharp, ensuring the flight attendant saw that this wasn't a casual moment. This was dignity restored quietly but unmistakably. The murmurs had settled into an uneasy silence. Some passengers averted their eyes, uncomfortable. Others gave brief, tentative nods of acknowledgement, as if realizing for the first time how fragile the boundary between disregard and recognition could be. "Thank you," I said quietly to my ex-husband, who stood by, arms crossed but attentive. His presence had been pivotal, yes, but this moment, this reclaiming of space and respect, belonged to Malik and me. He looked at me, a small, tight-lipped smile appearing on his face. "We're okay," he whispered. "Yes," I agreed, feeling the first genuine lift of tension since we arrived at the gate. "We are." But the flight wasn't over and the challenge wasn't behind us. The attendants and the passengers had all witnessed a subtle power shift, and I could sense the undercurrent of tension that would continue until we were safely airborne. I knew instinctively that we had only reclaimed a moment of dignity. The larger battle against bias and presumption was far from over. As we moved down the aisle to find our seats, Malik's small hand remained in mine. I could feel his heartbeat fast and uneven but steadying as we walked. The passengers' eyes followed us, some curious, some judgmental, some silently admiring the quiet resilience in a boy and his parent refusing to be dismissed. Finally seated and buckled, Malik leaned back in his chair, a small sigh escaping him. "That was scary," he admitted softly. "I know," I said, brushing his hair back and holding his gaze. "But you were brave, you did everything right." He looked up at me, eyes wide. "Even when she was mean, especially then," I said, my voice steady. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about acting even when you are." The engines roared to life, the plane taxiing toward the runway. I looked at Malik, seeing not just my son, but a young boy learning the first lessons of advocacy, of standing firm in the face of injustice. And I realized fully that this flight was more than a journey through the sky. It was a lesson in dignity, power, and the quiet strength of being seen and heard. As the plane lifted, the city shrinking beneath the clouds, I held Malik's hand tightly, letting him know without words that he was safe, that he was valued, and that no single act of bias or cruelty could define him. Not today, not ever. The plane settled into the sky, engines humming steadily, a soft vibration running through the cabin. For a few minutes, the tension seemed to ease, the hum of the passengers, quiet conversations blending with the rhythmic whir of the engines. But I knew better. Bias didn't vanish with altitude, and humiliation didn't dissolve just because the air pressure had changed. Malik leaned into me, tiny shoulders pressed against mine. He was trying to calm himself, but I could feel the tremor, the echo of fear that the flight attendant's actions had stirred. I brushed his hair back gently, whispering, "It's okay, you're okay, we're together, and that's what matters." He nodded, but his eyes were wide, scanning the nearby aisle as if expecting someone to reassert their authority at any moment. I understood. I had learned painfully that people in positions of power often tested you again, even when you had already proven your right to exist, to be treated with dignity. The flight attendant passed by, her posture stiff, her gaze avoiding mine. She carried herself as though nothing had happened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. I caught it, a brief, fleeting moment of recognition that perhaps she had overstepped, that maybe, just maybe, she had misjudged us. "Excuse me," she said, stopping just short of our row, voice neutral but tense. We need to check on the in-flight forms for medications. Please hold the bottle again." I sighed inwardly, expecting confrontation, but I handed it to her calmly. Malik's small hands lingered on mine, reluctant to let go. I could feel him bracing himself, waiting for another moment of humiliation. I refused to give her that satisfaction. "I understand," I said gently. "Please make sure it's logged correctly. Malik needs this now." She took the bottle and nodded curtly, retreating down the aisle. I let my gaze sweep the cabin, noting the eyes that followed us. Some stared with curiosity, some with judgment, and a few with quiet admiration. I didn't look for gratitude. I didn't expect acknowledgement. But the glances reminded me that the world was watching and every action mattered. Malik relaxed slightly, leaning back in his seat. I could feel him exhaling the tension he had carried for the last hour. "Mom, why did she throw it before?" he asked quietly, voice tinged with confusion and hurt. I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying to find the words that would comfort him but also teach him the difficult truth. "Some people," I said slowly, "don't see value in everyone equally. Sometimes they forget that kindness and respect should be given without question, but you are always worthy of it. Never forget that." His eyes searched mine, and I knew he understood, even if only partially. He was learning that injustice existed, that bias could strike in unexpected ways, but also that courage and composure could counter it, that in the face of humiliation, dignity mattered more than reaction. Minutes passed in silence, the quiet hum of the plane filling the space between us. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to the page where I had been jotting down the events from the airport and the initial moments on the plane. Writing, documenting, and reflecting had become a lifeline, a way to process what had happened, to turn humiliation into clarity. Malik leaned over curiously. "What are you writing?" he asked. I smiled softly, closing the notebook gently. "Just making sure we remember what happened. So we can learn from it and so we know how strong we are." He nodded, small fingers brushing mine again. "I'm strong," he said, voice firm. "You already are," I whispered, brushing a tear that had escaped down his cheek. "And the world will see that too in its own time." The flight attendant returned shortly after, this time accompanied by a supervisor. Their approach was measured, cautious. I could sense the tension between them, a silent acknowledgement that the earlier incident had been observed, noticed, and now required management. "Thank you for your patience," the supervisor said, voice polite but firm. "We'll ensure all protocols are followed correctly from here." I nodded, keeping Malik close, letting him see the calm in my posture. No apology had been offered, but the shift in tone, the presence of oversight, signaled a subtle victory. It wasn't just about the medicine, it was about authority being checked, about recognition that dismissal and humiliation had consequences. Malik leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "I don't like flying," he murmured. "I know," I said, stroking his hair. "But you handled this better than anyone could have expected. You were brave, and that bravery matters." The hum of the plane continued, a steady reminder of movement, of progress, of distance from the earlier chaos. And as I watched Malik, small and resolute, I realized that this journey wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, a test of patience, courage, and the unyielding bond between parent and child. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered cruising altitude. Passengers settled in, some closing their eyes, some reading, others staring at screens. I noticed a few discreet glances in our direction, quiet acknowledgement, perhaps empathy, perhaps curiosity. But most importantly, Malik felt safe, and for now that was enough. I held his hand, feeling the warmth and steady beat of his pulse, and I promised myself silently that this moment would not be forgotten. Not by him, not by me, and certainly not by anyone who thought they could dismiss a child's needs or a parent's vigilance. As the flight continued, I knew the challenges weren't over. There would be turbulence, literal and metaphorical, ahead. But for this brief stretch, we had reclaimed our dignity, asserted our presence, and shown that courage, even in small, quiet acts, could command attention and respect. The plane hummed steadily above the clouds, but my mind was far from calm. Every passing second replayed the chaos at the gate and the confrontation that had left Malik trembling in my arms. I knew that what had happened wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a reflection of assumptions, biases, and the kind of casual cruelty that people wield when they think authority protects them. Malik pressed his small hand into mine, a subtle reminder that he was still relying on me to navigate this storm. I focused on his face, tracing the delicate features that mirrored his mother's determination. He wasn't just a child, he was a beacon of resilience in a world that often demanded we be invisible. The flight attendant returned once more, this time with a quieter, almost apologetic demeanor. Her movements were precise, cautious, as though she had learned that our presence could not be dismissed. She handed Malik's medication back, this time with care, and I accepted it without a word, letting him see that control, calm, and dignity were stronger than fear or embarrassment. "Thank you," I said quietly, my voice even. "He needs this to stay safe. I trust you'll handle it properly." Her eyes flicked away, avoiding mine, and I sensed a tension beneath her composed exterior. Somewhere deep down, she understood that her earlier actions had been noticed, not just by me but by the watchful eyes of passengers and staff alike. Malik sat back, carefully taking his medication with my guidance. His small sigh of relief was audible, a fragile yet meaningful victory. I brushed the hair from his forehead, trying to convey everything that words couldn't. "You are safe. You are seen. You are worthy." Around us, the cabin continued its usual rhythm. Some passengers had their headphones on, lost in movies or music. Others whispered quietly to each other. But I noticed subtle changes. A few people glanced our way with curiosity, some with empathy. Small moments of awareness, tiny cracks in the invisible walls of indifference were forming. I thought about the conversation that awaited us on the ground. The world outside this plane, with its harsh realities and skewed judgments, would continue to challenge us. But here in this shared space, we had carved out a pocket of control, a zone where dignity had been quietly reclaimed. Malik leaned against me, eyes half closed, finally finding a brief moment of rest. I held him, feeling the rhythm of his breath and heartbeat, letting it remind me that no authority, no dismissal could erase the bond we shared or the strength he carried inside him. Minutes passed, stretching in their quiet intensity. I reflected on the lessons this flight had already imparted. Resilience is not loud, courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is found in the smallest gestures, the steadying of a hand, the refusal to be intimidated, the quiet assertion of one's rights. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 35,000 feet. Estimated time to destination is 2 hours. The words were routine, mundane, yet I felt a subtle shift in my perspective. Each mile brought us farther from the gate where humiliation had occurred, yet closer to the confrontation that would eventually demand acknowledgement. I pulled out my notebook once again, jotting down thoughts and observations, not just to process the event, but to ensure it was remembered accurately. The act of documenting transformed my frustration and anger into something actionable. It reminded me that every word, every detail carried weight. Malik peeked over my shoulder. "Are you writing a story about us?" he asked, curiosity flickering in his eyes. I smiled softly. "Yes, a story about bravery, about standing up when it's hard, and about the fact that the world doesn't always notice at first, but it will." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. I could see him growing more composed, more confident, even in the face of the injustice he had just experienced. His resilience was contagious, a quiet force that reminded me why I fought so fiercely to protect him. As the flight continued, I felt a tension in the cabin start to shift. A few passengers had started whispering, sharing glances of concern. Some had witnessed parts of the earlier incident and now seemed to understand that what they had assumed was routine service had actually been a form of subtle aggression. Recognition, even if delayed, was a powerful thing. Then, in a moment that seemed almost cinematic, the plane's aisle opened once more. This time it was someone new, a senior flight manager walking with authority and purpose, eyes scanning the cabin carefully. She paused near us, observing the situation with calm scrutiny. I felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone who could ensure that justice, even in this small moment, would be acknowledged. "Excuse me," she said, voice firm but respectful. "I understand there was an issue with medication earlier. I'd like to ensure everything is in order and that all protocols were followed correctly." I handed over the documentation I had carefully compiled, my hands steady despite the lingering adrenaline. Malik watched, quiet and attentive, absorbing the process and learning the subtle dynamics of asserting one's rights respectfully and effectively. The manager nodded after reviewing the forms, then looked directly at me. "Everything seems correct now," she said. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention and for your patience." I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me in waves. Finally, the situation was acknowledged. Finally, someone in authority had validated that what had happened was not acceptable. The humiliation that had begun on the ground had been addressed, not with anger or confrontation, but with accountability. Malik leaned against me again, tired but reassured. "Did we win?" he asked, his small voice curious. "Yes," I whispered, brushing his hair back gently. "We stood up, we were brave, and in doing so we showed that our voices matter, no matter how small they may seem." The flight continued in quiet dignity, a fragile peace settling over us. I knew challenges awaited on the ground, that confrontation and acknowledgement would eventually have to occur. But in this cabin at this altitude, we had reclaimed our power, one small victory at a time. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Courage doesn't always make headlines. It doesn't always earn applause. Sometimes it simply changes the course of a single, pivotal moment, and that can be enough to rewrite a story, even in the smallest of spaces. The cabin lights were dimmed now, the soft hum of the plane blending with the occasional clatter of trays and whispers from passengers. Malik leaned against me, his small hand gripping mine tightly. There was still tension in his body, a lingering echo of the earlier confrontation, but his eyes held a flicker of courage I hadn't seen before. The flight attendant who had thrown his medication earlier passed by again, her movements cautious. She avoided direct eye contact, but I could sense her watching, perhaps weighing her actions against the weight of observation, accountability, and the silent judgment of everyone who had witnessed the earlier chaos. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that the moment for real change wasn't over yet. The flight wasn't just a trip, it was a stage, a microcosm of every time a black child's needs were dismissed, every time authority overlooked injustice, and every time courage had to be quietly claimed. Malik looked up at me, eyes wide and unsure. "Will she be mean again?" he asked softly. I shook my head, pressing my forehead gently against his. "No," I whispered, "not this time. We know our truth, and nothing can take that away from us." Just then, the plane door to the cockpit opened slightly and a voice called over the intercom. "Cabin crew, please report to the cockpit for an update." A hush fell over the cabin. I felt a subtle shift in energy as passengers looked around, sensing that something beyond the ordinary routine was unfolding. I knew what this meant. This was no longer just a private struggle between a child and a flight attendant. The situation was escalating in a way that would demand accountability, that would force truth to confront dismissiveness. Minutes later, the senior flight manager appeared once more, now joined by the captain himself. His calm authority radiated across the cabin. Every eye turned, including the flight attendant who had caused Malik so much distress. "Ma'am," the captain began, his tone steady and firm, "I've been informed of an incident regarding a passenger's medication. Can you explain what happened?" The flight attendant faltered, her voice shaky. I thought, you thought what?" the captain asked, cutting through the hesitation. "Explain clearly." She swallowed, the weight of the cabin's gaze pressing down on her. "I thought the child didn't need it at that moment." The captain's eyes were steady, unwavering. "You threw away his medication without authorization. That is unacceptable. Every passenger's health is our responsibility. No assumptions, no dismissals." A collective murmur of recognition ran through the cabin. People exchanged glances, some leaning forward in disbelief. The imbalance of power had finally been addressed. The humiliation that had begun earlier wasn't erased, but it was being confronted, acknowledged, and corrected. Malik's small shoulders relaxed, a subtle yet meaningful victory. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting trust, relief, and the budding confidence that comes from witnessing justice in action. Then, as if the universe itself had orchestrated the moment, the plane door opened near the rear. Malik's father appeared, eyes wide, scanning the cabin until they landed on us. Relief and urgency collided on his face. "Malik," he called, moving quickly toward us. The cabin's energy shifted instantly. Passengers turned, the whispers of curiosity transforming into focused attention. The father's presence alone was a powerful force, amplifying the accountability already set into motion by the captain and flight manager. He knelt beside Malik, taking his son's hands into his own. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Malik nodded, though a tear slipped down his cheek. I'm okay," he whispered. The flight attendant's composure faltered completely. She stood frozen, caught between embarrassment, authority, and the undeniable truth of her actions. For the first time, there was no dismissal, no deflection, just recognition of error. "You saw it," I said quietly to her, my voice calm but firm. "You can't pretend it didn't happen, and you can't ignore it. This is real." The senior manager nodded approvingly, reinforcing the authority I already felt taking root. "We take the well-being of every passenger seriously," she said. "Your actions have been documented and corrective measures will follow." Malik's father hugged him tightly, then turned toward me, gratitude and understanding in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for standing with him, for protecting him." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "He doesn't need me to fight for him forever," I said softly. "He just needed to be seen, that's all." And in that moment the cabin held its breath. Every person on that plane had witnessed something extraordinary, not just a confrontation over medication, but a quiet reclaiming of dignity, respect, and authority that had been denied. Malik looked at me, a small smile breaking through the lingering fear. It wasn't triumphant or loud, but it was powerful, enough to remind us both that even in the smallest, most confined spaces, courage and truth could assert themselves. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Where there had been tension, there was now quiet respect. Where there had been dismissal, there was acknowledgement. And where there had been humiliation, a seed of justice had been planted, ready to grow. I leaned back in my seat, watching Malik rest against his father. He was safe, seen, and empowered, even after the chaos. And I realized, as the plane soared above the clouds, that moments like these, fraught with tension, fear, and injustice, could become catalysts for profound change, shaping the world in ways that only the brave could imagine. The cabin was quiet now, every passenger absorbed in the unfolding resolution. Malik sat safely beside his father, clutching his medication with careful hands, his small frame still trembling slightly from adrenaline, fear, and relief all at once. I sat beside them, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. Exhaustion from holding on through the tension, satisfaction because justice finally had been acknowledged. The flight attendant stood frozen near the aisle, her face pale under the dim cabin lights. There was no bravado left, no attempt to justify what had happened. For the first time, she was facing the consequences of her actions, not from me, not from Malik, but from the weight of truth, authority, and witness. The captain cleared his throat, projecting calm authority over the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to address the incident earlier regarding a passenger's medication. We take the safety and care of all passengers seriously. Appropriate measures have been taken, and I want to personally apologize for any distress caused." A soft murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the cabin. Eyes met in silent agreement. Authority had finally intervened, and the balance had shifted. The humiliation that had once felt suffocating now hung suspended in the air, observed, recorded, and corrected. Malik's father hugged him tightly, his face pressed against my son's hair. "You were so brave," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I can't even begin to tell you how proud I am." Malik smiled faintly, the tension easing from his shoulders. I didn't want to cry," he admitted softly. "I just wanted to be safe." "You were more than safe," I told him, holding back my own tears. "You were seen, and that's the strongest thing anyone can be." The flight attendant, finally finding her voice, muttered something incoherent, a mix of apology and disbelief. The senior flight manager stepped forward. "Your actions were unacceptable," she said firmly. "We will ensure proper training and accountability measures. No one should ever feel unsafe or dismissed for their health needs." Malik's father looked at me, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for standing with him," he said again. "For making sure he had a voice." I shook my head softly, smiling faintly. "He had the voice all along, I just helped make sure it was heard." The cabin atmosphere shifted entirely. Where moments ago there had been tension, fear, and humiliation, now there was relief, respect, and a profound sense of justice. Passengers exchanged glances, some offering small nods or murmurs of acknowledgement, witnessing not just a confrontation but a lesson in courage and accountability. I watched Malik, his small hands now calm in his father's, his eyes reflecting both the fear he had endured and the pride he now carried. The plane hummed steadily beneath us, carrying not just passengers but the weight of lessons learned, dignity reclaimed, and authority rightly challenged. And in that quiet, powerful moment, I realized something essential. Courage isn't always loud. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes courage is a small hand gripping yours, a quiet insistence on being seen, and a refusal to let injustice go unanswered. The rest of the flight passed smoothly, but the energy in the cabin had changed irrevocably. The humiliation, the fear, and the tension that had defined the first part of the journey had been transformed into recognition, accountability, and respect. And for Malik, that was everything. As we landed, the passengers disembarked quietly, some glancing toward Malik and his father with expressions of understanding and empathy. The flight attendant stayed behind to speak with the senior staff, her posture subdued. She would remember this moment for the rest of her career, the moment she faced the consequence of dismissing someone's needs, and the moment she saw that accountability could be both immediate and profound. I held Malik's hand as we walked down the jetway, feeling his small fingers relax in mine. "You did great," I whispered. "You were brave." He looked up at me, eyes shining. "I just wanted someone to see me," he said softly. "And they did," I replied, squeezing his hand. "And now no one can ignore that again." The airport lights glimmered outside, cold and bright, yet in that moment Malik carried warmth and power that no one could take away. The day that began with fear, humiliation, and injustice had ended in courage, recognition, and profound change. And in that there was hope, hope that every small voice, when protected and heard, could reshape the world.